Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today we're going to talk about dumbbell pressing specifically for the upper pecs. I think there's a lot of misinformation about what the upper pec does, how it functions, and how it functions specifically in relationship to the other portions of the pec as well as the delts and the triceps. And so first we're going to take a look at the anatomy before we dive into the exercise so that we can actually understand the X's and O's of the structures that we're talking about before we actually apply it in a resistance training scenario. So first things first, this is the complete anatomy is the app I'm using. I absolutely love it, and I've used it obviously in previous videos if you've seen those. And first things first, what we need to note about the differences in upper pec, the upper pec and the lower pecs are all highlighted sort of in gold here for reference. And the main difference that we need to note between the upper pec and the middle and the lower pecs is the upper pec attaches directly to the shoulder girdle. So when I say shoulder girdle, obviously all the pecs themselves insert into the upper arm here, and that's part of the shoulder girdle. But its origin, i.e. its point of attachment that's closer toward the center of the body, is attached directly to the clavicle. And so what that means is because there's an attachment from clavicle to upper arm, the upper pec is only responsible for bringing those 2 points closer together. So what it means is that unless the upper arm is somehow in front of the clavicle, sort of like in a orientation where you're reaching, it's not really ever going to be able to create a line of pull where it's pulling the clavicle forward, which, you know, if you were in that context, it wouldn't make sense to do an exercise that way anyway, right? Because then other things are moving the shoulder. But without, you know, making that too tangential, what that means in practice is that unlike the middle portion, the sternal portion of the pec, and the lower pec, which is what I'm sort of circling around down here, which attaches to the costal cartilages, which aren't actually shown here, the upper pec will just really effectively be moving the arm, and it'll be moving the arm in a direction that's sort of parallel to where I'm taking my arrow, sort of back and forth here, right? And so I have this sort of mobile ability here where within this app, I can show different positions. And so look at how the fiber orientation of this thing will sort of change in relationship to the other pecs as the arm is sort of moved out to the side. So when we talk about targeting the upper pec and aligning it in such a way where we can essentially get the most amount of stretch, which in other words will determine its mechanical advantage in relationship to other tissues here, we want to sort of use an arm path that's not super tight to the body, right? Because that will sort of put the middle and lower pecs from this perspective, you can see, this is why this app is so helpful, as you can see a bunch of different perspectives. It'll put more stretch in the middle and the lower pecs to keep the arm a little bit tighter. But when we start to actually move the arm slightly more out to the side, you can see that now all these fibers are sort of more in parallel. And if we move the arm backward behind the body in this position, in a slightly wider arm path position, right? Again, not an arm path that would be something, more like up here, but an arm path that would be sort of in the middle ground over here. And we move the arm back in this position, right? These upper pec fibers will really stretch a good amount. So what is that really to say? Well, it's to say that if we move the arm in sort of a very slightly low to high direction, and we load it in a way where we get a good amount of a stretch moving forward and backward, we're going to not only sort of advantage it from a fiber orientation perspective, but also from a shoulder girdle motion perspective, because if we wanted to move the shoulder girdle maximally, we would keep the arm a little bit more narrow. But without further ado, if we're actually looking at how to set these up, I think a really good point to make to begin with is that we don't want to just randomly incline a bench at like 45 or 50 degrees. A lot of people will angle benches that way and assume that because the upper pec is labeled broadly as upper, right, upper stuff, that it will do the more upper looking motions. And that's not the case. Remember origin and insertion and how that fiber direction is actually much more horizontal, basically almost purely horizontal in relationship to something like the deltoid, which is angled much more vertically, at least the front portions of the delt. So the front portions of the delt will do a lot of work in something like a military press or a much more vertical press, but if we're looking at training the upper pec, it's going to be a lot more of a horizontal angle, at least relative to, I think, what is commonly perceived. So I'll just let this play, and this is me doing a dumbbell press for my upper pecs, specifically. And what you'll notice is that I'm not too focused on getting too deep, right? Because the deeper that you go, that doesn't necessarily imply more stretch, right? We want to go as deep as we can actively control, which is essentially just our ability to maintain a push toward the ceiling as the weight lowers and not sort of letting the weight just sort of smush us uncomfortably toward the bottom. And what you'll note, and I think the best angle to sort of see it at, is probably right around like here or something, where if you can imagine the image that we just pulled up with the complete anatomy app, right? My arms are at a width where I'm stretching, I'm sort of taking those fibers, those upper pec fibers, into a straight line. And as I'm lowering my arms, I'm only lowering as much as, again, I can control, but also I'm sort of only pushing to a point where, the weight isn't fully locked out. But if I go to the top here, it's at a point where my elbows are sort of approximating a straight position, but they're not totally straight, so that I don't have zero load on the shoulder, or effectively zero load on the shoulder, right? We don't really want to get to a point, unless we're maybe learning a skill or trying to press as much weight as we possibly can, which is not always aligned with a hypertrophy-based goal, right? We want to get to a point where our arms are sort of soft locked, or at least that's what I prefer, to be able to, quote, maintain tension or maintain what we would call a moment arm to the shoulder so that the upper pec remains loaded. Again, if we lock our arms, then the only thing that's effectively going to be holding our shoulders there are our sternal pecs, right? Our middle pecs, and potentially some of the lower pec, depending on the position. But anyway, without getting too far away from that, a really good way to set this up, and I think this is like about a 20-degree incline or so, and that's kind of how I like to end my sets, is like at failure, not really being able to get out of the bottom. If we angle around like a 20 or 30-degree incline, you'll have a much better idea of like what you can actually comfortably do with upper pec stuff. Because again, you're not really moving out of that upper pec territory into that front delt territory. And again, there may be some contribution or an ability to sort of move into a position where at higher inclines you are able to target the upper pecs, but only if you really arch the crap out of your back. Which again, it's like you could just choose to arch the shit out of your back on a higher incline, or you could lower the incline, have more loading where you're stronger, and at the same time not have to really contort your spine in any sort of active, uncomfortable way. Where the goal is, again, really just to focus on pressing. So I'm going to show a different angle here just to sort of demonstrate like where my arm path is actually at. And again, you can see that, as we talked about earlier, it's slightly wider, and I'm not, again, too focused on moving too far backward because, again, and this is the reason that I mentioned the whole attaching to the shoulder girdle, not attaching to the shoulder girdle thing. The more that the arm moves backward, the more that the shoulder blade needs to move backward. And the more that the shoulder blade moves backward, the more advantage that we'll say something like the middle pec will have in this particular case to pull the shoulder girdle slightly forward. And so when we're talking about advantaging a muscle, we want to advantage the muscle from, again, a fiber orientation perspective, like we mentioned, but also from a function perspective, because again, the whole point of me bringing up the point of attachment thing is if there's a lot of shoulder girdle motion, like clavicles and scapula moving backward, the upper pec is not going to be able to contribute to the motion, or at least as much of the motion as it would if we weren't trying to focus on moving those things as much. It's kind of like if any of you have ever trained your rear delts very specifically, you want to sort of pick motions where you're just moving the upper arm. Because if you're moving the upper arm at the same time that you're moving the whole shoulder girdle, a lot of other things like lats and traps are going to be involved in moving the shoulder girdle, right? Whereas just moving the upper arm is really the function of the rear delt. So in a similar way, and sort of in an inverse way, because it's on the other side of the body, when you're training upper pec, you want to focus a lot on just moving your arms and not moving your shoulder girdle as much. And that doesn't mean that you should intentionally restrict motion of your shoulder girdle. It simply means that you should use the range of motion where your shoulder girdle isn't as involved in terms of its necessity to move. So what this means in this particular context is just, in simple terms, not going as low. Okay, and we shouldn't really even need to go that low to get a maximal stretch on that thing, on the upper pec. Obviously, that'll be an individual thing, but there are a lot of commonalities between people. And especially when we're dealing with like an incline type scenario, going lower is not really necessarily helping us, like I said, in this particular context. So if we look at it from this angle, which is like an angle from the back here now, right, very similar story here where you can imagine these fibers sort of stretching out. So again, the check marks and the things that I really wanted, the boxes that I want to make sure I have checked within upper pec press is a slight incline, right, basically to make sure that, and again, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, this is the most important thing maybe to mention from this angle. We want to make sure that when we're in this bottom position, the upper pec, in terms of the arm path, is really aligned well. And when I say well, pretty much parallel to the arm, which if you can imagine the anatomy image, that we were doing, showing earlier, right? This sort of wider arm path would make those fibers parallel. We want to make sure that that's the case and that's the alignment in the bottom, because as we start to press up toward the top, we're basically just sort of staying in that little column, that sort of narrow window of arm path to be able to press up and in toward the inner side of the sternum and the inner edge of the clavicle, right? So the bottom portion with any sort of dumbbell press is really going to be the relevant portion, because that's where we have actual resistance on our arms, like I said, which is why we don't really tend to lock, or why I don't tend to lock or advise locking toward the top. And then as we press and as we sort of progress upward and sort of higher in the motion, we get to a point where, we're basically just staying in a line with that same arm path. We're just moving in and out in that sort of plane of motion is technically speaking what we would call it, as in the bottom of the motion. So the major checkpoints or the major checklist again would be like a subtle incline. Start with maybe a 20 or so degree, slightly wider arm path, pressing in toward the inner side of the clavicle and the top of the sternum. And basically, again, just maintaining that wider arm path, not focusing too much on moving the shoulder girdle all the way down. And not focusing too much on, again, that lock position. That's pretty much all you need to know from a dumbbell pressing upper pec standpoint, is just find that fiber alignment. And then basically from there, once you find that fiber alignment, set the angle appropriately, which will be slightly above, what a horizontal press would be. So again, and maybe this is the biggest take home, is the upper pec, although it is more vertically oriented than the middle pec, and certainly more so than the lower pec, right? It's going in somewhat of an opposite direction. It's not so drastically different from the middle pec stuff that you need to change the angle hugely. And I think that's why a lot of people at the end of the day assume that they have lagging upper pecs. Well, it's like, number one, your upper pecs are a lot smaller than the rest of your pecs comparatively in terms of surface area, but also simply because a lot of people treat their upper pec stuff as if it were front delt stuff, which again, the front delt stuff will be much more vertically oriented and a much more vertical challenge. So hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, as always, please leave them in the comments and I'm happy to address them and expand on any of the topics or simplify anything I said. If anything I said was confusing along the way, I know I speak fast and I speak about, some topics that you may not have heard about before. So if I can clarify anything, please let me know. And thanks all for watching.